Hey, I'm Hypermobile, and if you're listening to this, I'm guessing you might be too. Hi, my name is Alex. I'm your Hypermobile host, and today we are talking all about my favorite topic. We're talking about hypermobility and fitness. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. If you know me personally or you follow any of my social media accounts, you might see what I get up to at the gym, and you might see what a big part of my journey fitness really has been, and finding ways to not only safely exercise, but to happily exercise. So for today's episode, what I thought we'd do is we are going to pretend like there's a little time machine, and I'm going to think of all the rules and all the guidance and like the wisdom and professional expertise that I have now. And I'm going to think of what I wish I'd known a decade or 2 decades ago or 3 decades ago, back when I was struggling to exercise safely and happily in a hypermobile body. But before we do that, I want to give a shout out to the HQ crew, the members of the Hypermobility private membership community Discord. Last week we had an amazing live with a fabulous guest speaker. So basically every week we do a live on Sundays with yours truly. Once a month we have on an incredible guest, and we occasionally do special events, and it's just, the community's been growing. It's awesome. I think of it like my second hypermobile brain. If it's something that you want more info about, please do check out the show notes. But without further ado, let's get into today's episode. Rule number 1, and there are 6 rules total, by the way. Do what makes you happy. I really get frustrated when I hear about people having all of these exercise plans that they hate. Even the most boring exercises can be made to be fun. So I think do what makes you happy. I know it sounds like it's not important, but it is. So if there's one thing I've learned from all my years of experience now working with the hypermobile community, is that hypermobile people tend to have strong feelings on things. Maybe it's the neurodivergence. Maybe it's the fact that I just give my patients a safe space where they can have strong feelings about things. But hypermobile people tend to either, like this type of exercise or not like this or love this for whatever reason. And I think so often, we're trying to focus on what's the best exercise. And that's important, that clinical rigor, this looking at like the evidence, thinking what's the safest and best way we can help this person exercise. That is important. Absolutely. But patients are people first and foremost, and they have thoughts and feelings and ideas about what they do. And when I think back to my fitness journey, so I was a swimmer. I raced butterfly and freestyle, and that was my thing. I swam with the London Aquatic Club growing up for about a decade in Canada. So if you're listening to this and you're on that club, please do let me know. That would be so cool. But anyways, I fell in love with swimming. My mom saw me in the water, and it was my happy place from a young age. I'd be swimming in like the most freezing cold water. There was this story of when we went to a cottage on a holiday and nobody was in the water, but I was there splashing. And my mom was like, this girl needs to swim. So I got into swimming, and it did so much good for me. I was a child who was always a little bit heavier. I wanted to find ways, of course, that I could safely use all this energy I had. And a lot of other sports, I tried them, but I kind of didn't really like them. So swimming was something I just fell in love with. For me, it's always been a quiet and happy place. It's a place where the water is like a different world. Like you can just go in the water and it's peaceful. For me, it's peaceful. Every shavasana I've ever done, if you don't know what a shavasana is in like a yoga practice, it's when you kind of just lie on your mat at the end and kind of take a minute just to appreciate where you are. Obviously, it's not doing it justice, but it's like a mini meditation, okay? Anyways, with the shavasana, I would always imagine just lying on the bottom of a swimming pool or on the bottom of, underwater in a sandy beach on a sunny day. Because for me, I think I just always felt that wonderful in the water. So in a way, I'm kind of grateful at the time that, we didn't have quite as much information coming in, because I worry that my mom might have been told well, swimming's not good and she should do something else. And for me, it was really important. It was an important part of my journey that I swam. And it helped me, although it did harm me, of course. I ended up getting injuries long-term. I had to stop swimming because of my injuries. And I think it actually led to quite a few issues. It's something which I think had a net positive effect on my life. And it's something that I'm so grateful I was able to do. That being said, of course, no exercise is perfect. Swimming is certainly not the perfect hypermobility sport that it's hyped up to be. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But I want to get back to the rule, which is do what makes you happy. I have had patients come see me. There are patients who have wanted to do sports like CrossFit, or they've wanted to go rollerblading, or they've wanted to attend. There was one patient in particular who wanted to attend a sports day themed bachelor party. And, there are risks to everything in life. If you're hypermobile and you're listening to this, you will know that sometimes doing nothing at all has risks. My worst injuries have come from walking or sleeping. So when it comes, again, going back to that assessment of physical activity in the hypermobile patient, or if you're someone listening to this and you're thinking about yourself, like, I'm hypermobile, what sport should I do? Or what physical exercise should I try and do? I think it's important to sit down and ask yourself, what do I love? What do I kind of enjoy or have an interest in and want to try to see how I feel about it? Or if you hate all physical activity, you don't get on with sports, it's not your thing, that's okay. I want you to ask yourself the question I ask my patients who have those feelings about physical activity, which are valid and acceptable. I'm not here to be like, yeah, it's the best, like you should love sports. You don't have to love everything, or you don't have to love anything, I should say. But what I want you to ask yourself is, what do I hate the least? So rule number 1, do what you love, or at the very least, do what you hate the least. And that leads us straight into rule number 2, which is, but don't overdo it. So if there are any swimmers out there listening, you might be familiar with the high volume of training in most competitive swimming programs. I started out swimming, was very happy, got a bit faster, got promoted to a higher level in the club, did more and more and more practices, because this is just normal for the sport. Like, it's a sport where there is a very high volume of training sessions. I think at the end of my decade of swimming competitively, we were doing approximately 24 hours of training a week. We would routinely have double days, which are 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours in the evening. And this is just, again, I didn't know any better. I just thought, like, this will help me get faster. This is good for me. Swimming is good for me. Exercise is good for me. Therefore, more swimming exercise is good for me because it's good for you. And I think it ultimately was not good for me. I think it caused me a lot of problems. There's something called Overtraining Syndrome. I don't know if you've heard of it before, and I will link some research papers on this in the show notes. You can go check out my website, hypermobilityhq.com. That's where I put the detailed show notes, because often on the different apps where I post the podcast, YouTube and Spotify in particular, there's not enough space to put all the research papers. So go to hypermobilityhq.com if you want to see the full show notes. But with overtraining syndrome, again, there's kind of a vague definition. There are different things. There's overreaching is what they call it. I don't think it's called overreaching syndrome. Some sports scientists will just refer to it as overreaching. There's overtraining syndrome. But here's the gist of it, okay? So with sports and with physical exercise, and this applies to everyone, I think people sometimes come across these technical ideas and think, oh, this is only for athletes. No, muscle is muscle is muscle, okay? But you have to overload tissues progressively and overload systems progressively. So do a tiny bit more than what the body's capable of doing at present in order to stimulate adaptive changes. I've talked about the body as a bioeconomy before. I'm not going to go through the full analogy right now, but basically your body tries to run efficiently. It's not going to invest in a ton of muscle for you if there's no reason for it to do so. And the reason that you give it to do so is by progressively overloading it through strength training, for example, right? Anyways, overtraining syndrome is a multi-system condition where we have an athlete who's been training for years, and swimming is one of the classic sports where this happens, and other high-volume sports like rowing and cycling appear as well. And the athlete starts to get unwell. They start to feel fatigued all the time. They start to have changes in their mood. They start to have changes in their eating behavior and approach to nutrition. They start to have immune system changes. Maybe they're getting some upper respiratory tract infections. They start to have changes in their hormonal profile. If we do different hormonal tests, we can see some changes there in some instances. They start to have changes in levels of amino acids like glutamate and glutamine, which affect protein synthesis. And again, you can check out the research at my website if you'd like. But they have all these changes happen that have to do with kind of the hormonal state of the body, as well as protein synthesis, which of course affects connective tissue. And what's interesting when you read about overtraining syndrome is it sounds weirdly like HEDS and HSD, so hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome and hypermobility spectrum disorder. I'm not saying they're the same thing because they're not, but we're seeing two things where we have a multi-system involvement. The person feels unwell. The markers seem to vary depending on the individual person. So there have been, in recent years, attempts to do systematic reviews and so on of overtraining syndrome to see, okay, like how can we diagnose this? How can we pick it up more in athletes? And it seems like there's a big heterogeneity, there's a big variability in the ways in which overtraining syndrome will manifest in an individual athlete. And I've talked before about kind of, why I think hypermobile people should be treated like athletes, not in terms of like training programs, but why I think we need to take some of those principles from sports medicine and from this approach with athletes where we're fighting for those 1% improvements and apply them to people with chronic health issues and disability. Because you just get better results when you pay more attention and do things in greater detail. But I also think it's interesting to just see, again, what happens when you do too much. So these are athletes who are doing too much in a training program. Is it perhaps similar to the hypermobile person who does too much unknowingly just because they're alive? Is this similar to the young hypermobile person who, isn't an athlete, but they're living their life and they eventually just kind of have a decline in their symptoms, in their teens or their 20s or whatever? Is there a comparison there? Have they accidentally overtrained just through the physical challenges or requirements of existing? I think it's a really interesting question. Anyways, if I could go back in my time machine and talk to myself, I would say to little 12-year-old Alex, I know you love swimming and I know you want to be that A+ member of your team, just like you're that student, who likes to do all her homework and whatever. But don't go to every practice. I wish that I had gone to half the practices I went to. I would have swam faster. And if we go back again to athletes and hypermobile people with chronic health issues, there are issues with recovery. So overtraining syndrome, people theorize that it happens because the athlete's body who's affected, it gets to a point where they're no longer able to recover. Their recovery has slowed because of certain physiological changes that have happened, and they are now not able to recover in the same way that they were previously. And the same thing goes for people with HEDS and HSD because their bodies just run less efficiently. They do protein synthesis and build connective tissue more slowly. Things don't happen in quite the same way as they do in someone's body who has quote unquote normal connective tissue, or as I like to say, collagen typical connective tissue. So we see a problem there just in terms of recovery management. So if I was going back, I would just be telling myself, tell your coach that you need to be different. If I was, the parent of a child who was on the swim team and I knew they were hypermobile, I would just say, my child loves swimming. I want them to swim, but they need to be going to 50% of the practices of the rest of the team, or 75% or whatever. There is no research on what percentage is correct. Okay. So don't quote me on that. But I would want the coach to understand that this decision was being made by me as a parent because I wanted to make sure that my child was having adequate time to recover between sessions. And I really do wish I could go back in time and see if that would have resulted in me swimming faster, because I loved it. And I was always disappointed that I put in so much work and it was like spinning wheels. I couldn't make any progress. I wasn't getting that same, I was putting in the same input as other members on my team, but I wasn't getting the same output. And it did eventually start to feel like my coaches were frustrated with me and they thought that I was just maybe not trying as hard, when in reality, my connective tissue was hypermobile. I wasn't able to get the same changes in terms of physiological adaptations from training as other members on my team. And that's probably why I didn't go as fast as I wanted to, even though I tried my absolute hardest. So don't overdo it. Rule number 3, try to avoid making your world smaller. So going back to swimming, My low point was basically like crying in my goggles from pain in my shoulders. And I would just grind my teeth and get through like 4 hours a day of that. Like that is messed up. But anyways, because of my shoulder pain, I ended up seeing various physiotherapists and different healthcare professionals. And I was diagnosed with, I think, like rotator cuff syndrome or whatever, right? It was not the best healthcare management. But everything was, it wasn't a good physio experience, to be entirely honest. So basically I was going there. There's a viral video of me on TikTok. I think it might be on Instagram too, where I talk about my shoulder feeling homeless because I was sitting there and the physio's like, what's wrong with your shoulder? And I said, it's not painful like right now. They're like, does it hurt? And I said, no, but it feels homeless. It doesn't feel like it's where it should be. And that was, of course, me trying to say in a very roundabout way that it felt unstable or that it had felt like it was subluxing. And then, of course, they did ask, like, have you dislocated it? And I said, no, because I have never, still to this day, dislocated my shoulder or any other joint, really. So anyways, with that, the problem became that the physio was then giving me treatment, which was not effective, and giving me exercises, which made my symptoms worse. And it got to the point where I was like talking to the physio and asking what I should do. And the only thing which would ever elicit my symptoms or bring them on was really raising my arm above 90 degrees repeatedly at in a freestyle stroke or a butterfly stroke. So the physio told me, she said, just stop raising your arm overhead. Now, she probably meant like stop doing a high volume of raising your arm overhead, but trying to be a good patient. Again, I was the kind of person who always wanted to like do the best job at everything I was trying to do, right? So I was like, I'm going to be the very best little patient. I just stopped raising my arm overhead. I avoided it. I stopped lifting weights overhead. I was doing some body pump classes at the time at the Sherwood Forest Body Pump in London, or what's it called? Sherwood Forest Good Life with body pump classes in London, Ontario. So I was doing my little overhead presses, prior to that in these different movements, and I just stopped doing them entirely. And it helped. It did help a bit because when you take away the movement, which aggravates the symptoms, of course, you're going to experience a bit of an improvement. But this improvement was followed by a steep decline. So there are some photos. Again, I've done videos on TikTok and I might throw some in a blog post on the website. But I quickly lost all of the muscle mass I had around my shoulder. Like you could start to see almost the bony drop off in the joint itself. I lost all of my deltoids and probably my rotator cuff. There was just no muscle there because the adage, use it or lose it, really is true when it comes to your musculoskeletal system. And with that loss of muscle mass came an increase in instability, an increase in pain. And these were the dark times. My worst years of symptoms were age 18 to maybe 23, around there, maybe 17, but around like late teens, early 20s. Like those were the worst years for me in terms of symptoms. And what triggered it really was me listening to that physio. I wish more than anything that I had been supported in getting a second opinion. We really couldn't. We were paying for it privately. It wasn't accessible to me, but I wish that I had been supported in getting a second opinion, or I wish that someone had just come up to me and said, before you take this advice to stop raising your arm overhead and just stop doing things that irritate your shoulder, let's see if we've missed something. Let's see if there's something that can be done. Because this seemingly small decision of like, I'm just not going to lift weights overhead, or, I'm going to try and avoid raising my arms overhead, had serious, serious consequences. And if I wasn't as lucky as I have been, if I didn't have the right things happen at the right time and accidentally fall into the right career, I wouldn't be where I am today. I wouldn't be able to use my arms. I wouldn't, it scares me to think of what would have happened if I had not been able to rebuild that muscle mass that I lost. And it was not easy. It took years of doing all the right things perfectly all the time. And this is what makes all this stuff so hard, is you don't get a day off to not be perfect. You have to manage all these things constantly, and it is not easy. But if I could go back in a time machine, I would be screaming in my ear, do not let this person make your world smaller. Fight for your ability to continue to do movements, and try and find alternative ways. In terms of making the world smaller analogy, the way that I think of it too, it also affects your happiness. So I love video games. I don't know if any of you do, but I love RPGs or role-playing games, for those of you who aren't familiar with the terminology. And in these games, you have a character, like The Witcher 3 or Legend of Zelda. These are all kind of good examples in some ways. And your character can interact with the world around them, right? So in The Witcher 3, the main character is Geralt of Rivia, and he can like walk or jump or use a sword or crouch, right? There are all these different movements and physical things he can do in his world. Now, the game becomes less fun the fewer movements you have. And the game becomes more fun the more options you have, right? The more you can interact with the world around you, I think just the more free you feel. It's wonderful to be able to do what you want with your body. And it's a privilege, I think, that many people who have don't really appreciate enough. Anyways, when you take something away from a patient, and there have been cases, there have been clinical situations where I have told a patient, like, hey, I think we need to, reconsider this movement, or we need to, look at this. It has to be such a serious and thoughtful decision. It can't be a decision that's made lightly. Because let's go back to this example that I had the ability to raise my arm overhead basically taken away. I was told, that's not good for you, don't do it. And I became nervous to do it, very understandably. What am I going to lose next? When my knees start to hurt, am I going to be told, oh, well, you shouldn't be, walking or whatever? Or if my back starts to hurt, oh, you shouldn't be sitting. Like, you start to open up the door to greater and greater decreases in that patient's ability to interact with the world, which have serious effects. And of course, in this community, disability is common. There is a significant amount, I'm losing my words, a significant amount of people with HEDS and HSD are disabled. I think the statistic just of the general population is something like 1 in 5 people are disabled. Like, disability is so prevalent, and we don't talk about it enough. And I will do an episode one day talking about that word and what it means and my relationship with it, because it's something we, I think, as a community need to talk about more. But even for people who are disabled and who cannot interact with the world around them in certain ways, we have to fight to support them in being able to interact with the world around them as much as possible. This is why mobility aids are so important, because instead of having that person's world become so small, that mobility aid can open up their ability to do things that they weren't able to previously. Their world becomes bigger, and they have a greater capacity for happiness and for interacting with the world around them. So anyways, that is my talk about do not let your world become smaller. If someone's telling you something which is going to make your world become smaller, get second opinions, get third opinions, try and make sure that it's the right clinical decision, because sometimes clinical decisions are incorrect. Rule number 4. Prepare the child for the path, not the path for the child. Or should I say, prepare the body for the world and not the world for the body. Anyway, the reason I'm saying this is my mom had a plaque growing up in our living room which said, prepare the child for the path, not the path for the child. And this was, just reflective of her position as a parent, where she wanted to really equip us to exist in the world and everything it threw at us. And I think she did an awesome job. But the reason that I mention this in the context of hypermobility and exercise is because I see sometimes exercise strategies and exercise programs that patients have had prescribed, which don't really seem to relate to their ability to actually do things in the world. Sometimes the exercise selection seems quite arbitrary. The patient's confused about why they've been given it. I'm quite frankly confused about why the patient's been given it, because it makes no sense to me either. And there's a lot of, I think, just the potential for time wasting with poor exercise prescription and like sadness. I think all this stuff is hard. All of the HEDS, HSD, hypermobile connective tissue stuff, other connective tissue disorders, it's all really hard. And when you get given an exercise program that feels utterly pointless and doesn't feel like it's going to have a real world translation for you, that becomes very, very demotivating. So when I work with my patients, and again, there is a whole spectrum of patients I will work with. I would say in particular, the area at which I excel, I would say, are kind of the more sporty hypermobile people, the people who either are going to the gym and who want support in that, or the people who were going to the gym previously, have had a decline in their symptoms and want to get back. Like I'd say that's where I'm strongest in terms of my clinical experience and professional expertise. But I do occasionally work with patients who are not as physically active and cannot safely be as physically active. And that's okay. But for all of my patients, I try to help them develop bodies that let them live in the world in which we exist. And the world is made of free weights. My phone, this is a free weight. My water bottle is a free weight. These are all free weights. So again, going back to hypermobility and exercise, when I had my shoulder injuries, I got put in what I call resistance band. I was going to say HE double hockey sticks, but that sounds so lame. It's my podcast. Resistance band hell. I got put into resistance band hell where I was being told to do all these like external rotation, this exercise, whatever. And it was just so boring and felt so pointless. And it didn't seem to give me any results, no matter how diligently I did my exercises. So I think it's always so important to think, okay, the patient has these issues, or I as a hypermobile person listening to this, I have these issues. Why am I even exercising? Like, what do I want to do with my body? Do I want to just have less pain? Do I want to be able to maybe go for a walk in the park with my dog? Do I want to maybe be able to carry my groceries home? Like, what is the actual functional outcome? So this is something I think we do always need to keep in mind. Do resistance bands have their place? Absolutely. In fact, I think every kind of exercise has its place. I think there's use for machines in different contexts, free weights, body weight exercises. It all has its place. But we always have to be thinking, whether it's with yourself as a hypermobile person or as a healthcare professional, like, what are we trying to achieve here? Because with my patients, when they know, hey, we're going to do this, 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 and this, because my goal is to help you be able to walk your dog for 10 minutes once a day. That's my goal, or whatever it is to start with, right? And we're talking obviously like a little like toy poodle here or something. I don't have dogs. I don't know how much they need to be walked, but it helps the patient get excited. It helps give them a reason to do things. And most importantly, it gives a clear outcome measure. So it's kind of stressful as a healthcare provider to set goals when you're working with patients, because it makes you accountable. Because if you don't achieve them, the patient's going to be like, hey, you told me like we would get to this point and we haven't. And that's not a good feeling. So I think it's so important, again, whether you're a patient or a healthcare provider, to think like, what are we actually trying to achieve? And even if it's a long-term thing, that's totally okay. But have little mini goals away around along the journey. Have little checkpoints that you might hit, okay? Because that helps to make that patient know that we're doing this for a reason. It's not just so you can be really good at the clamshell exercise or really good at glute bridges. Like, we're doing this for an actual reason. Rule number 5. There is no such thing as an inherently good exercise for hypermobility. I cannot tell you how much I just shake my head when I'm on my phone looking at social media and I see people be like, this exercise is good for hypermobility, or Pilates is the best for hypermobility, or yoga is bad for hypermobility. Like, no. As I like to say, nothing is good, nothing is bad, and everything is complicated. So let's talk through it. Let's start with Pilates. So Pilates has some great things. I have many patients who love Pilates. I have enjoyed some Pilates classes in my time, although it's never been an activity I've done regularly. But there are different kinds of Pilates. There's mat-based Pilates. There's reformer Pilates. There are Pilates classes. There's one-to-one Pilates personal training, right? Like, there are many different ways Pilates can be done. When it comes to Pilates as an exercise, it's actually something I've had a really hard time with. So the last time I was at like a Pilates kind of brunch event, I went up and I spoke with the instructor, and it was someone who I quite respected their opinion on stuff. And I said, hey, whenever we do like that sit up or crunch position, like my neck hurts. So you're just going to see me like keeping my head down because it hurts my neck. And as me, as like a 32-year-old professional who works with hypermobile patients, and this is all I do, I really value my opinion on what feels right or wrong for my body. And actually, you know what? I don't care what your qualification is or not. If you're someone listening to this who lives in a hypermobile body, your opinion about what you feel when you exercise matters. And I basically told the instructor, like, it feels to me like the pain of re-injury and not the pain of healthy muscular fatigue. And I was told, oh, no, no, what you're feeling is actually the pain of healthy muscular fatigue, and it's the feeling of your neck getting stronger. And I was just like, no, 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 it's the pain of me getting injured, because I always get a headache the next day when I do that. And maybe it's the hair. I have a lot of hair. Maybe it's a long neck, or maybe it's a big brain. Just kidding. But who knows what it is? But it's something where, like, I've had my technique checked so many times. I'm quite a meticulous person when it comes to this. Everyone says it's perfect, and I still really struggle. So can I do Pilates and can it benefit me? Sure. I like reformer Pilates. I think there are so many clinical applications for it, and I'm super interested in it. And it's something which I hope to like learn more about one day. And I enjoy working with patients who do it as a practice, because I think there's so much benefit from it. But am I still going to modify it for my little uniquely hypermobile body? You betcha. Same with yoga. So I have done more yoga in my time than Pilates. I have more experience with that. To be clear, I've never done it as like a spiritual kind of practice. I've done it just as basic, kind of yoga practice classes at like a gym. But anyways, with yoga, the mistake I made was I was holding end range positions for extended periods of time and often having pain the night following a class or the next day. So if I was to go back and do yoga now, and when I do yoga occasionally, I won't hold at an end position. I will constantly be moving. I'll kind of be back going into that tension and coming off it, and just a continual flow. And I find that just by doing that, I avoid aggravating my symptoms, still get the benefits of moving, the benefits of all of the different types of breathing patterns, and just the experience, which I love, quite frankly. But yoga is not bad for hypermobility. It's so much more complicated. And again, just like Pilates, there are many different kinds of yoga. There's restorative yoga, yin yoga, ashtanga yoga. There are like many different kinds of yoga. There's one-to-one instruction. There's practice where you do it just by yourself. There are classes, right? So it is silly to just say like, this is bad and this is good. And we're now going to talk about something I haven't talked about before, which is CrossFit. I know you're going to be all like, this person is like not with it. Like, what is she saying? Hypermobility, CrossFit cannot mix. Let me explain to you. So, CrossFit for me really basically got me back into doing fitness, which sounds wild, but it got me exercising again. I came across it through some work I did in my early career with some very elite athletes. And I thought like, wow, this is cool. And I really liked the variety of movements that I saw, just because I felt like if I couldn't do something one day, then I could find something else to do. And that has served me well. This variability, this variety that we see is really, really helpful. Now, are there many problems with CrossFit? Of course. There are problems with swimming too. The overtraining that's endemic in swimming, quite frankly, is a huge problem. But when I saw a sport or a fitness kind of routine that had so much variety, I could focus on cardiovascular exercise. I could focus on trying to get a pull-up. I could focus on moving weights in different ways. I thought, you know what? That variety, A, that looks fun. And B, I think that I'll always be able to find something that my body can do. And I, to this day, do CrossFit. And I don't talk about it publicly because I know people are going to be saying some things, but it works for me because of how I modify what's on the board. And this is something, again, for my patients who do these types of higher level kind of fitness pursuits. I talk with them heavily about how they have to be their own coach. Like they have to become a specialist in themselves. Because if I was just to go every day and do exactly what's written on the board, I would get so injured, If I was to listen to even a really knowledgeable coach above myself in a class setting, I would get injured because they can't feel the weirdness that I feel regularly. So I always joke that I'm like that kid on the soccer pitch, like picking flowers in the corner of the field. I'm doing my own thing. Is it CrossFit? Yeah, it is. Like I just did the open this morning and that was all great. But is it most importantly what's right for me and my body? Yes. And another thing that I love about CrossFit, which I think we don't see again in other physical activities as much, is the idea of scaling. So CrossFit, again, it varies highly. And I have no financial affiliation with CrossFit, just to be clear with that. But what I like is the idea of scaling. So you can have an exercise, and if it's too hard, you find an easier version. And if that's too hard, you find an easier version. And if that's too hard, you find an easier version. In my head, when I'm developing exercises for patients as part of their prescribed exercise protocols, I'm always, I'm trying it firstly with them. My patients will never get an exercise that they do not try under my supervision because I want to make sure it's the right exercise for them. But if I can see that it's not quite right, or the patient tells me that they don't feel comfortable with it, I'll say, you know what, let's try this instead. And if that's not right, I say, let's try this. So the idea of scaling, I think, is so useful. And of course, coming back to the emphasis on free weights, what I've really enjoyed in my time doing CrossFit, at least, is how there are a variety of different types of objects that you can hold and move that have weights. And again, the greater the variety, the more I think protected in some ways you are, because it does often seem like it's repetitive movements, which result in really problematic injuries. So there are kettlebells, and they often have very light weights. Again, at the gym chain, you might not find weights that are as light. I find in my experience, based on some of the CrossFit boxes or gyms I've been to, that they do have like light weights often. So you can find really light kettlebells or a light dumbbell or a light slam ball or whatever, but you're getting to move in different ways as well. It really gives you an appreciation of how you can move. So when I was trying to rehab my way out of my shoulder injury, I really struggled with pushing movements. So any type of pushing, whether it was overhead or in front, that really irritated my symptoms. But I found, weirdly, that pulling was okay. So I started doing all of these ring rows. I couldn't even do one pull-up at the time. I was not doing pull-ups, but they had these rings hanging off of the bar thing. And I would basically be almost upright, standing, pulling myself. And over time, I would walk my feet under. So I was having to deal with more and more of my body weight. And then eventually I got to the point where I was able to do a pull-up. But again, it's having these different ways of moving and thinking, if I can't push, can I pull? If I can't pull, can I push? If I can't do this, can I do that? And if I can't do that, can I do this? It's having that mental gymnastics when it comes to exercise that I think is so protective. And rule number 6, which we've kind of talked about already, but it's you do you. There are so many weird, wonderful, and wild ways to move your body. I have had patients who enjoy pole dancing as a physical activity. I have had patients who enjoy, what do they call it? The silks or aerial gymnastic stuff. I have had patients who enjoy, I think I mentioned rollerblading earlier. I've had patients who enjoy Pilates of all kinds. I've had patients who enjoy, there are just infinite beautiful and cool sports. And I think that we need to, instead of putting people down and making people feel like, oh, this is bad for hypermobility or this is good, we need to support patients and people in finding what's right for them. Because if I was going through my journey now with social media as it is, I might have seen content out there and just been like, oh no, I can't possibly be benefiting from what I'm doing because it's bad for me. And that might have made me not go down the path I went down, which has been life-changing for me, quite frankly. So if you're someone who's listening to this, please trust yourself. I think I say that in a lot of episodes, but listen to your body. Of course, listen to your healthcare providers as long as they're good and you are feeling safe in their clinical management of your healthcare issues. And, you do you. Anyways, if someone can make a time machine and send this episode to 13-year-old me, that would be fantastic. But I hope that for those of you who are listening, that you do find this advice helpful. I hope that you are finding ways to safely exercise in your uniquely hypermobile body. And I hope to have you back next time for yet another episode of the Help I'm Hypermobile podcast. Take care. See you next time.